Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving, as I did. Greetings to our guests and our honored guests. And I'd like to send my greetings to Mark. I'm glad that you're home. And for Marlene and Dick and Jan and anybody else that is far off watching, hope you enjoyed your Thanksgiving. Quote, on October 30th, 1935, at Wright Airfield in Dayton, Ohio, the U.S. Army Air Corps held a flight competition for airline manufacturers, vying to build the military's next-generation long-range bomber. It wasn't supposed to be much of a competition. In early evaluations, the Boeing Corporation's gleaming aluminum alloy Model 299 had trounced the designs of Martin and Douglas. Boeing's plane could carry 5 times as many bombs as the Army had requested, and it could fly faster than previous bombers, almost twice as far. The Army planned to order at least 65 of the aircraft. A small crowd of Army brass and manufacturing executives watched as the Model 299 taxied onto the runway. It was sleek and impressive, with a 103-foot wingspan and 4 engines jutting out from the wings as opposed to the usual 2. The plane roared down the tarmac, lifted off smoothly, climbed sharply to about 300 feet. Then it stalled, turned on one wing, and crashed in a fiery explosion. 2 of the 5 crew members, including the pilot, Major Ployer P. Hill, died. The investigation had revealed that nothing mechanically had gone wrong. The crash had been due to pilot error. Substantially more complex than previous aircraft, the new plane required the pilot to attend to the 4 engines, each with its own oil fuel mix, the retractable landing gear, the wing flaps, electric trim tabs that needed adjustment to maintain stability at different airspeeds, and constant speed propellers whose pitch had to be regulated with hydraulic controls, among other features. While doing all this, Hill had forgotten to release the new locking mechanism on the elevator and rudder controls. The Boeing model, it was deemed, as a newspaper put it, too much airplane for one man to fly. The Army Air Corps declared Douglas's smaller design the winner, and Boeing nearly went bankrupt. Still, the Army purchased a few aircraft from Boeing as test planes, and some insiders remained convinced that the aircraft was flyable. So a group of test pilots got together and considered what to do. What they had decided not to do was almost as interesting as what they decided to do. What they decided was that the Model 299 pilots did not need further training. It was hard to imagine having more experience and expertise than Major Hill, who had been the Air Corps' chief of flight testing. Instead, they came up with an ingeniously simple approach. They created a pilot's checklist. Its mere existence indicated how far aeronautics had advanced. In the early years of flight, getting an aircraft into the air might have been nerve-wracking, but it was hardly complex. Using a checklist for takeoff would no more have occurred to a pilot than a driver backing his car out of the garage. But flying this new plane was too complicated to be left to the memory of any one person, however expert. Test pilots made their list simple, brief and to the point, short enough to fit on an index card, with step-by-step checks for takeoff, flight, landing, and taxiing. It had the kind of stuff that all pilots know how to do. They check that the brakes are released, that the instruments are set, that the door and windows are closed, that the elevator controls are unlocked. Dumb stuff. You wouldn't think it would make that much of a difference, but with a checklist in hand, the pilots went on to fly the Model 299 a total of 1.8 million miles without one accident. The Army ultimately ordered almost 13,000 of the aircraft, which it dubbed the B-17, and because flying the behemoth was now possible, the Army gained a decisive air advantage in the Second World War, unquote. All the quotes that I'll be referencing in here are from a book called The Checklist Manifesto, How to Get Things Done Right, by Atul Gawande, copyright 2009 by Picador Publishers. Often, it's not the complex stuff where most of our failures lie. It's the lack of executing the routine. The basic stuff we should know how to do, the stuff we take for granted. It's a failure to perform the basics. The Army Air Corps test pilots came up with an ingeniously simple solution to correct the problem of cutting through the aircraft's complexity in order to ensure the basics were adequately addressed. The checklist was simply to remind the pilot, who may often have been overwhelmed by the various tasks demanding his attention, not to forget the basics. In our ever increasingly hurried and complex society, with our ever more hurried and complex lives, the chances of ignoring, forgetting, becoming distracted from, or experiencing interference with, when it comes to executing the basics of our Christian lives, become ever greater. I posit that prayer and Bible study are the basic necessities to a Christian. So when these items remain undone over a period of time, catastrophe lies await. Just as catastrophe awaited the B-17 when the basics for its operation were neglected. So I pose a question. What's on your daily checklist? Quote, in the 1970s, philosophers Samuel Gorovitz and Alasdair MacIntyre published a short essay on the nature of human fallibility. The question they sought to answer was why we fail at what we set out to do in the world. We can build skyscrapers, predict snowstorms, save people from heart attacks. In such realms, Gorovitz and MacIntyre point out, we have just two reasons why we nonetheless fail. The first is ignorance. We may err because science has given us only a partial understanding of the world and how it works. There are skyscrapers we do not yet know how to build, snowstorms that we cannot predict, and heart attacks that we haven't learned how to stop. The second type of failure the philosophers call ineptitude, because in these instances the knowledge exists, yet we fail to apply it correctly. This is the skyscraper that is built wrong and collapses. The snowstorm whose signs the meteorologists just plain missed, and the stab wound from a weapon the doctors forgot to ask about, unquote. So the study claims that human failure over events within our control can be boiled down to two reasons: ignorance or lack of knowledge, and ineptitude or the inability to correctly apply said knowledge. As a Christian, our knowledge primarily comes from the scriptures. Is Bible study on our daily checklist? And are we able to check it off every day, or is it often neglected in our lives? Do we make space for it, allocating a specific time or a quiet place in our home so we can retreat there and spend the time that we need to? Or are we constantly dragged or pushed to and fro by various concerns, emergencies, or endless distractions that demand our attention? We must be very careful not to neglect this incredibly important basic necessity. For Solomon wrote in Proverbs 28, verse 9, you don't really have to turn there, it's just one verse. He stated, "He who turns away his ear from listening to the law, even his prayer is an abomination." So the scriptures themselves provide us a warning about neglecting them. There's other places in the scriptures also that we could turn to. Of course, we must also apply what we learn, or we will experience ineptitude in managing our lives as far as applying the knowledge of God. Jesus Christ made an analogy that we're all familiar with. It's recorded in Matthew 7, verses 24 through 27, if you turn there. Therefore, Matthew 7, verses 24 through 27. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on a rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against the house, yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on a rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against the house, and it fell, and great was its fall. It's interesting to note that in this example, both men had heard the word, right? One had acted on it. So none of us here deal with ignorance. We all know the law. But do we act on it? Do we take time to study it, to replenish ourselves with it? Because we have to do that continually. It's also interesting to note that the same storm hit both men's houses, just as we'll all experience storms in our lives. However, the house of the man who heard and acted withstood the storm. Returning to the essay on the nature of human fallibility, quote, The question they sought to answer was why we fail at what we set out to do in the world. One reason they observed is necessary fallibility. Some things we want to do are simply beyond our capacity. We are not omniscient or all-powerful. Even enhanced by technology, our physical and mental powers are limited. Much of the world and universe is and will remain outside of our control. Unquote. If we're neglecting our Bible study, then it is highly likely our prayer life is also in the dumps. After all, bringing our petition to the one who is all-powerful and omniscient can help us overcome our limitations and failures. Another basic necessity that we should have on our daily checklist is prayer. Are we too bored, bothered, or busy to approach it with regularity? We are guaranteed failure and necessary fallibility, as the study stated, if we don't approach it on a regular basis. And if our prayers and Bible study are suffering, then here's a very simple prescription which may be of help. Luke recorded the disciples' question to Jesus about how they should pray in Luke 11, verses 1 through 4. It happened that Jesus was praying in a certain place. After he had finished, one of his disciples said to him, "Lord, teach us to pray, as John also taught his disciples." And he said to them, "When you pray, say, 'Father, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our sins, for we ourselves also forgive everyone who is indebted to us, and lead us not into temptation.'" So Jesus' response was an example prayer that we know of as the Lord's Prayer. Matthew records it in more detail. And our pastor, John Miller, is nearing completion on a series delving deeply into the Lord's Prayer. It's a series of Bible studies and sermons that are available online at our congregation's website, on Facebook, and on YouTube. If anybody in this room or watching are struggling with an approach on how to do daily Bible study, or following along, I recommend that you watch some of these videos. You could treat them as a personal Bible study, follow along, take notes, and because the subject matter is how to pray, it should also help with that. Basically, killing off two birds with one stone. In conclusion, or to conclude, quote, "In a complex environment, experts are up against two main difficulties. The first is the fallibility of human memory and attention, especially when it comes to the mundane, routine matters that are easily overlooked under strain of more pressing events. A further difficulty, just as insidious, is that people can lull themselves into skipping steps even when they remember them. In complex processes, after all, certain steps don't always matter. Perhaps the elevator controls on airplanes are usually unlocked and a check is pointless most of the time. Perhaps measuring all 4 vital signs uncovers a worrisome issue in only 1 out of 50 patients. This has never been a problem before, people say, until one day it is. Checklists seem to provide protection against such failures. They remind us of the minimum necessary steps and make them explicit. They not only offer the possibility of verification, but also instill a kind of discipline of higher performance," unquote. Our lives are most certainly complex processes. We have been implored in the past to simplify our lives, and that's sage advice. However, it is not only the cares of this world that may plague some of us, but things beyond our control, such as physical ailments, financial hardships, and other trials can make life a very complex and a very distracting exercise. I realize that the concept of checklist sounds very simplistic, especially for something as complicated as failure avoidance. Interestingly, from my personal experience when I've spoken with people who excel in their endeavors, they often excel and practice the basics. It's not the esoteric that they're concerned with. Failure most often occurs when the basics are not met. Most certainly there are other basic necessities that should be on our daily checklist. Regular Sabbath service attendance is one of them. That's what immediately comes to mind. But I'm not trying to be comprehensive about what should be on the checklist, simply pointing out that we need to be diligent about meeting our basic necessities as a Christian, and that becoming distracted from them can lead to spiritual catastrophe. Quote, "We have an opportunity before us, virtually in any endeavor. Even the most expert among us can gain from searching out the patterns of mistakes and failures and putting a few checks in place. But will we do it? Are we ready to grab onto the idea?" Unquote. All the quotes were from the book, The Checklist Manifesto, How to Get Things Right, by Atul Gawande, copyright 2009 by Picador Publishers.